Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining this session. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about the topic of ESG today. This is a very, shall we say, hot topic in the industry. And so I wanted to cover a little bit about what ESG is. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the use cases that are related to the notion of ESG, and then also drill down on one specific area that we have seen started to pick up some interest when it comes to providing information to ESG initiatives, and that is the topic of IoT. So we're going to cover a few of these areas, and we're going to try and do that in a short amount of time today, but I'm going to give you a broad overview of ESG and how IoT can be applied. So just one quick slide on TIBCO for folks that might be new to TIBCO as an organization. We're an enterprise software company, been around for a number of years, really focused on data. We have three pillars in terms of how we bring this focus to data. We talk a lot about how we can connect to any data source at any speed, how we can unify different data sources together and manage and govern that data, and then also how we can predict, if you will, or apply analytics against data. So we really work with some of the largest, with our companies, largest companies across the globe, work with our software in order to provide different capabilities and solutions around data. So the first thing I wanted to actually point out is just some growing, why do we have this growing interest in ESG initiatives? What are some of the themes? Why is there so much attention being brought to ESG? And in many cases, this was actually first being driven by the investment community. So investors were looking for a way to determine how well an organization was performing when it came to things like environmental sustainability, sort of some social elements, as well as corporate governance. How well is an organization performing against those elements? And that actually, in many ways, dictates how well they will perform financially. And so investors were looking for a way to measure, if you will, companies' performance in these areas, because that would then translate into potentially investment performance. And we've seen this with various examples. There's been examples in the industry where maybe an organization did not conform to, let's say, emissions regulations as much as they should have. And as a result, there's potentially billions of dollars that are involved here. And so from an investment community standpoint, this was a key focus and actually some of the original drivers behind ESG. Now, there's also, though, of course, drivers from the consumer as well as employees. So, and you can see here on this particular slide that there's really this idea that consumers are really focused on understanding how well an organization, again, performs against the environment from social elements or from corporate governance perspective, because they're actually interested in buying goods and services from organizations that perform better in each one of those areas. And in many cases, they'll actually pay more. So it's not just a matter of kind of comparing two different companies. And if one company, it's not purely a decision based on price in terms of whether they acquire goods and services from one versus the other. ESG and an organization's even reputation with ESG initiatives can have an influence on consumer behavior, and of course on things like employee well-being and how well employees actually, how well they feel about their company that they're working for, and subsequently how long they even stay at that company. So there is a large focus on ESG initiatives from the consumer as well as from employees. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of consumers will literally stop buying from companies that have a history of treating the environment poorly, treating their employees poorly. Maybe they're not as, say, strict when it comes to regulatory requirements, things like that. So there is a large element here of the employee, the worker, as well as the consumer when it comes to actually dealing with corporations and using ESG initiatives to determine which ones they do want to deal with. We also know that higher employee satisfaction scores are actually related to organizations do better in ESG initiatives. Now, this is also important because it comes down to things like employee retention, or how well can an organization actually entice, if you will, high caliber employees to work for them. And if an organization, again, has a reputation or has demonstrated that they perform poorly in ESG initiatives, they are actually going to not perform as well when it comes to things like, again, employee retention and some of these other elements. So employee satisfaction and ESG are actually very directly linked. And again, this is another reason why ESG initiatives are getting a lot of interest in the industry and in the market today. So I've used the acronym a lot, ESG, and I've alluded a little bit to what the E and the S and the G stand for. Let's drill down and look at these a little more deeply. And so first of all, the E is really dealing with environmental elements, or the topic of sustainability. Right, so this is how an organization behaves as it pertains to the environment. How well does it behave when it comes to things like sustainability? How well does it avoid, if you will, or negative environmental impacts, especially when you get into things like the manufacturing space, oil and gas, some of these other verticals. So this one's kind of obvious. There's a lot of use cases and a lot of concerns and considerations around the environment, of course. And so the E in ESG is really focused around the environment and sustainability. Now, the S is more focused on how well an organization either treats its employees, or what is the impact that an organization has on society as a whole. So how well does it manage its relationships with customers or partners? How does it treat its employees? How does it deal with elements of productivity? How does it build brand loyalty? How does it improve its reputation? Right, these are all elements that really fall under the S, if you will, of ESG, the social elements. And this is a little harder in terms of how you measure this, and I'll get into that in a moment. But the S is actually really a growing aspect of ESG. And again, it's really around things like diversity and reputation, and just how well an organization contributes to society as a whole. And then finally, you have the G, and this is related to governance, corporate governance. So this is more concerned with how well an organization operates. Does it follow regulatory guidelines? Does it uphold shareholder rights? How transparent is it when it's actually conveying different metrics and reporting on its performance, and so on and so forth? Is it truly reporting on its ESG initiatives, or is it more what we call ESG washing? So situations where they just kind of have a bit of fluff, if you will, around ESG and what they're doing in ESG, as opposed to actually having some hard and fast data that proves what it is that they're doing in this area. So the G is really around governance, accountability across the organization, compliance with regulatory and legal requirements, and then how well it's actually protecting things like data and consumer rights and so on. So that's really what ESG is meant to address. It's around the sustainability and ethical impact of an organization. And again, that can have obviously positive impacts on the environment. It can have positive impacts on society, social elements, as how you deal with employees and consumers and partners. And then also, of course, it can have positive impacts on corporate responsibility and corporate governance. And you see here, there's various ways in which you can measure this. And I've just listed a few here. This is from a nonprofit organization that came out with a set of potential metrics, again, across different verticals as to how you might actually measure ESG initiatives. But this could be measuring anything from energy efficiency to greenhouse gas emissions, staff turnover, training. I mean, you see the list there. How do you measure corruption? That's going to be largely determined by a number of different aspects, and then even revenue from new products and capabilities. So now, one of the challenges, of course, is these metrics are not standardized, and that can lead to a number of different issues, as I will describe here a little later on in the session. Now, various examples, and I've listed a few already just because of the measures, but these are some additional examples of ESG initiatives. So you have carbon intensity reduction as an example, investments in green technology, again, complying with environmental regulations. Energy conservation is a big one. This is where you get into concepts like smart buildings, smart cities, right? How do I actually optimize how I'm using energy? Green technology investments, so distributed energy resources like wind and solar. Diversity and inclusion is very important, especially when it comes to even, let's say, the social element of ESG, or even the governance aspect, making sure that employees are treated properly without bias, and that there is a proper set of hiring practices that are implemented at a particular organization. And then again, code of conduct, ethics policies, data privacy and protection is a big one. Cybersecurity would fall into that arena. So there's a lot of examples of ESG initiatives in the market today. And of course, the challenge is that how do you convey these, and how do you collect the data that then can support the reporting of metrics that are associated with these initiatives? And so I'll talk about that here in a moment. So again, when you look at ESG adoption, though, yes, there's a lot of use cases and a lot of examples. It's very, very important. There's been increased emphasis from the investment community, as I talked about, but there's also a lot of barriers. And one of those barriers is just, and I mentioned this earlier, is a lack of consistent reporting standards. There is no one set way that an organization can kind of point to say, okay, this is how I should report on how I perform from a sustainability standpoint, or how I perform when it comes to social or corporate governance. There's really no set way to do this. And so in a lot of cases, it's left to interpretation. Now, what that then leads to is it's really, really hard to distinguish between what is a good measure and what is a bad measure. If one company reports its ESG metrics this way, and another company does it in a completely different way, how do you compare those two? Right? Is one better than the other? Maybe, maybe not. Again, depending on how they reported those metrics. Another challenge is also just a lack of data. We all talk about having too much data in an organization, but when it comes to ESG, where do I get that data from? How do I collect it? How do I measure some of these elements? The environmental element might be a little bit easier to measure. It's maybe a little more well-known, if you will, but how do you put a score on cybersecurity or corporate governance or diversity, right? How do you measure that? And so there's some challenges there, both in terms of identifying the metrics and then gathering the data that you need to support those metrics. And then in many cases, there's even a lack of transparency. There might be just insufficient disclosure. A corporation may not be fully bought in, if you will, to the fact that they should be reporting ESG metrics. And so they may not be as transparent with these metrics as they should be. And then in a lot of cases, there's even just a lack of awareness of the fact that you should be including these in your overall corporate strategy, right? So in many cases, it's just not a priority. And although that we find organizations are being forced, if you will, to rapidly change in this respect, again, driven by forces from consumers and partners, employees, into the investment community, and so on, government regulations as well. So lots of barriers to ESG adoption. It's not easy, but one of the ways in which we can hopefully streamline and solve at least part of those issues that I just described is through IoT. Now, if I take a step back, we all know that people are really transitioning, and this is rapidly accelerating to a complete set of digital services. If anything, the last couple of years has taught us is that we have more digital capabilities now than we did in the past even. And that, again, was born out of necessity, again, for the last couple of years. But you really look at it, the digital footprint itself also has an impact. So when you look at even things like sending an email, that has an impact on environmental sustainability, right? You're using storage, you're using network bandwidth, you're using other kinds of digital capacity, which again, go back to the notion of environmental sustainability. So there's, it's not free. Just because we transform to digital doesn't mean that it comes free when it comes to ESG initiatives. And we need to be aware of this, and we need to figure out the best ways to optimize our use of digital technology so that we're not, burning, if you will, in power or whatnot in situations where we shouldn't be. Now, edge computing, though, can help with this. So normally what organizations will do is they'll collect data from the edge, so IoT devices, wearables, sensors, all those sorts of things. They'll move that data to the cloud, they'll process it, and then come up with an answer and potentially send that answer back to the edge, right, to tell that piece of equipment to go do something. Now, again, going back to my conversation around environmental sustainability, there's an impact to that. Right, I'm using more network bandwidth, I'm using more CPU, I'm using more storage, right? So how can I reduce that and still come out with the desired outcomes? And so one of the ways that you can do that is through edge computing. So take that compute power and move it to the edge, do more of your processing at the edge so that you're consuming less network bandwidth, less CPU, less storage, and you're still actually making decisions in a timely and contextual fashion. Right, so edge computing is one way to kind of feed into, if you will, the notion of ESG and environmental sustainability. And we'll talk about a few more here in the next set of slides. So edge computing is key. Take your processing, move it closer to the edge, reduce decision latency, and also reduce the impact that you might have on, in this particular example, the environment. Right? So we do see a lot of organizations looking at edge computing as a way to not only, again, improve how they identify opportunities or threats, but also reduce the overall impact they have, in this case, on the environment. And this is true across a number of different verticals. So whether you're looking at logistics and supply chains, things like route optimization, demand forecasting, whether you're looking at smart buildings, alternative energy, as we talked about, whether you're looking at predictive maintenance in the transportation industry, whether you're looking at drone inspections for potentially inspecting buildings or early detection of fire, those kinds of things, manufacturing, this is smart metering, this is sustainable practices, the connected worker, how do I properly develop and create a healthy environment for my workers, or whether I'm looking at retail and looking at asset tracking and how I can optimize my overall supply chains as it pertains to delivering goods and services. All of these use cases can have IoT applied to them, edge computing concepts applied to them, which then subsequently can feed into an overall ESG strategy. So lots of different use cases around a variety of different verticals, and IoT and edge computing can facilitate an organization's ESG practices in each one of these. One other example that is often talked about is the use of IoT edge in the circular economy. So now with the circular economy, you're concerned about reuse, refurbishment, recycling, right? How do I make sure that the products that I'm producing aren't just used once and then thrown away, if you will, right? How do I continue to reuse and recycle and break it down and take the raw materials and use those to assemble a different product, right? This is the circular economy. And so IoT can really facilitate the streamlining of such an economy, and again, facilitating my ESG initiatives. So on the environmental side of it, I can look at how I can streamline manufacturing. How can I have preventative maintenance practices in place? How can I improve product packaging, shipping? How can I provide consumers with product provenance information, right? Where did that product come from? What's its history? How was it made? What raw materials was it assembled from? Right? That is important as well to consumers. So lots of areas here where IoT can be applied to the circular economy on the environmental side, but it can also be applied on the social side. So you can now start to educate customers around the circular economy and how products are being recycled or refurbished. Right? The raw materials that came from one area went into this product, and then that product, when it hit the end of its life cycle, was broken down, and those components were then used for another product. It's important for customers to know that, right? And that's also, of course, beneficial from a social side as well. And then finally, you can also refer to the governance aspect of this. So start collecting the data that you need to prove to regulatory bodies or to other legal entities that you are meeting different environmental or social requirements. You can streamline processes. You can look at things like data privacy. You can, again, improve the transparency and data accuracy, right, from deploying edge capabilities. And so circular economy, lots of conversation around that across the globe today, and IoT and edge computing can definitely play a role in improving ESG practices within that economy. Now, ESG just becomes part of a broader data journey. And whether you're actually looking at how you identify your ESG issues, what it is that you want to measure, what's the data that you need then in order to fulfill those measurements, how are you going to convey that information to interested parties. Just like you have a data journey and how you're transitioning from, let's say, on-prem systems to cloud-based data technologies and building out data pipelines, ESG has to fit into that data journey as well. And there's different strategies and approaches that you can use, best practices and so on, to really incorporate ESG into your overall data journey. Now, this is something that we've also focused on at TIBCO. Our TIBCO Labs initiative, we actually had a hackathon last year, which is really focused around IoT and environmental sustainability. And this year, we are actually going to be announcing very shortly a new hackathon, which is going to be focused on the broader notion of ESG and how IoT can be applied to ESG initiatives. So definitely you want to check out our hackathon details. Now.tibco.com is where you can go to find out more information. But we really wanted to focus on this aspect of ESG, how IoT can be applied to make ESG initiatives stronger and better. So lots of areas here where IoT can be applied, whether it's improving overall visibility, data accuracy, data collection, improving automation, whether you are looking to make your decision-making much more real-time in nature, or whether you're actually looking for broader information to feed into an analytics platform, IoT and edge computing can definitely fit into an organization's ESG initiatives. So just to wrap it up, really avoid ESG washing. Don't just put a bunch of buzzwords in a report and that's what gets presented to the investment community or to consumers and so on. There's really needs to be a focus here on providing solid metrics and coming up with a set of standardized metrics that can be used to convey an organization's ESG performance to the industry. You won't, of course, solve all ESG problems right out of the gate. So you want to make sure you prioritize and determine what's important to your organization based on your maturity, based on things like your organizational goals and strategy. So you want to start small, focus on those areas that are a priority for you, and then grow your ESG program from there. And IoT, of course, as I've mentioned, can definitely play a role in feeding you the data that you need to be successful in, again, your ESG practices. Now, another area of technology that I'm not going to get into on this call, but is also interesting when it comes to ESG is really around blockchain. And we are putting forward a book on blockchain and different enterprise use cases, including ESG in the enterprise. So be sure to register and check that out. And lots of other resources. TIBCO Labs does a number of projects and whatnot in a variety of different technologies and a variety of different spaces. So be sure to check us out in these different locations as well. And with that, I thank everybody for attending today's session. And I guess at this point, let's see if there's any questions.